Dozens of world leaders are gathered in Glasgow, Scotland for a decisive climate summit. Leaders will discuss and debate their plans to reduce emissions by the year 2030, a deadline set by the Paris Agreement. Currently, no country is on track to meet those goals. Mark Phillips reports on what's at stake.
The official soundtrack of this conference may be the Scottish pipes, but the unofficial one is the sound of a ticking clock. Time is running out, the gathering of 120 world leaders was told, on efforts to avoid the worst catastrophes of climate change. What we've seen so far, the melting polar ice, the rising waters, the severe storms, the heat, these are just a taste of what unchecked global warming can bring.
4 degrees, and we say goodbye to whole cities. Miami, Alexandria, Shanghai, all lost beneath the waves.
A little history lesson is useful here. When delegates at the Paris conference 6 years ago celebrated the landmark agreement there, it was on the understanding that each country would follow up with individual plans to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. The goal was to limit global warming to under 2 degrees Celsius, 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Limiting the rise to 1.5 degrees C was even better. They haven't done that. Which may be why protesters here supplied their own pipe band soundtrack, complete with caricatures of some of the leaders. The commitment to deeper carbon cuts this conference was supposed to produce hasn't happened. And this was the only presence in Glasgow of Chinese President Xi. The scientific calculation is that greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut by half by the end of this decade. But as it stands now, Elaine, they're still set to rise.
Mark Phillips, thank you. For more, let's bring in Thomas Armstrong. He is the president of Madison River Group, a strategic consulting firm that focuses on the impacts of climate change. He also served in the White House from 2011 to 2015 as the executive director of the United States Global Change Research Program. Tom, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. As you know, China is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, but President Xi Jinping is not attending COP26. In a written statement, he did urge stronger climate action, but fell short of making any new pledges. How important is China in this global fight, and could President Xi's absence signify challenges ahead?
Well, thanks for having me on tonight, Elaine. Absolutely, China is an imperative player in the COP26 negotiations. They're by far the largest contributor of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and not having them on board would be disastrous. Now, that gets back to the leadership not being there. Does that really matter? In terms of the negotiations, probably not. It's more symbolic than anything, and it's certainly a political gesture that has some symbolism that is important at that level. But for the negotiations, they have a great team, a top-notch team of negotiators that have been doing this for years, as does Russia, Saudi Arabia, and other ones that may not be present in terms of a figurehead. But in terms of the negotiators, they are here. If they were not here, I would be very worried. But they're here, and they know what they're up against and what we're all up against. I'm highly confident that they'll work very closely and cooperatively with everybody else.
Well, what about other global leaders missing from COP26, like President Putin of Russia and President Bolsonaro of Brazil? What could their absences signal?
Well, again, I think it's symbolic, and it certainly spells that there are some concerns and disagreements at the political level. But when you get right down to it, the goal is to find ways to reduce each of the 197 countries' global emissions of greenhouse gas pollution to the atmosphere, so that by 2100 we can all work and claim victory in arresting global temperature increases limited to 1.5 degrees C above where they are today. That's imperative for saving island nations that have very little elevation change and are highly vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge that's amplified by climate change. Now, keep in mind that that also means that the United States is at risk as well with our mid-Atlantic states and the Gulf of Mexico in particular. We're in the same boat. So we're all hands are on deck for this. I think everybody knows what's at score. There's political gesturing going on that's separate from the negotiations. The negotiations, I'm confident, will bring up some very good conclusions and recommended actions. It's then up to the politicians to take it from there and to make it happen. And that's what's been missing.
Well, President Biden addressed the summit Monday. He apologized for the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement. The U.S. is also trying to reach net zero emissions by 2050 by investing in cleaner energy and scaling up carbon dioxide removal technology. What is your assessment of President Biden's climate goals?
Well, I think the climate goals, when you go even further than that, they deal with domestic spending and international spending on not just mitigation, but on adaptation as well. In the period of time between now and 2100, there's going to be a lot of suffering and a lot of dealing with the impacts and effects of not only climate change impacts occurring today, but climate change impacts that are going to get worse, more frequent, more intense over the next 50 to 100 years. So having that in the plan, the strategy that deals with both domestic spending as well as international spending for helping developing nations come up with more powerful and more effective mitigation plans and especially adaptation strategies is really important, and that is in the Biden climate strategy. The other piece that I think is really critical is the connection to money in Build Back Better with the infrastructure. The infrastructure that is being proposed and the money for it is going to need to have a lot of significant information from the climate side to ensure that the infrastructure we build for the future can sustain the impacts of what will be, as I pointed out before, amplifying conditions of climate change up until the period where we can really arrest temperature increase and start to see a downscale in both temperature and, thank gosh, impacts and effects as well.
Well, finally, Tom, the president of the European Commission urged leaders Monday to implement carbon emissions reduction rules because, quote, nature cannot pay that price anymore. What do you expect to hear in the days ahead? Will leaders finalize the rules of the Paris Agreement, and can climate action be sufficiently monitored?
Yes, there are plans already. There's a very good and lengthy handbook on measurement, reporting, and verification, MRV, that's born from other efforts at the United Nations global level. And so there is a good strategy, at least a framework for the plan on how to measure, report, and most importantly, I think, verify the NDCs, the contributions from the individual countries that they have proposed and committed to. So the big part of this is trust but verify. At the end of the day, those verification reports have to be handed over to the United Nations framework for their endorsement and verification as well. That will be a very important step, but there already is a lot of work afoot going on about modifying the rewrite of the MRV handbook, and it's there. So I think the real issue now is to see implementation at the country level. That's what we need to really see. And when it comes to nature, making sure that we're taking into consideration the health and welfare of ecosystems while we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
All right, it is a complex problem. We'll see what action actually results from these world leaders coming together. Thomas Armstrong, Tom, thanks very much for your time.
You're welcome, Elaine. Thank you.